Redskins, Capitals, Wizards and the Nationals. Repping for my teams cause I stay loyal to the capital. Drop me off at
NFL Draft Week. It is finally here, and the draft begins on Thursday with the first round. I am amped. I'm pretty sure the Redskins are going to end up taking Chase Young, but if they did take Tua or they did take somebody else, this would be insane. I cannot wait to see what happens. Amped. Absolutely amped. Now, I don't know what the sports world is going to talk about after the draft. We'll probably break down the draft a little bit, but then what? Very curious to see what happens. I know the Last Dance came out, so maybe we'll just break that down to no end. That sounds awful. Can't do that. Just enjoy The Last Dance. Just enjoy it. That's it. Welcome to another episode of District Divided. I am your host, Amit Singh. This week, Benjamin Robinson, creator of GrindingTheMocks.com and good friend of mine, joins me to talk about mock drafts and talk about the NFL draft and, you know, who he sees going to the Redskins and what he thinks of the top of the order in the first round. Aside from that, we're going to continue the Dwayne Haskins film breakdown, part 2. We go through those final 4 games that everyone's been talking about. Were they really as good as people said, or were people just sort of overhyping him? We get into that. And finally, a little fun segment, the best draft move the Redskins have made in the last 20 plus years and the worst draft move the Redskins have made in the last 20 plus years. Decided to look at my lifetime only just to make it a bit easier. Otherwise, I'd be going back to the 1930s. I wasn't about to do that. So enjoy the episode. I hope you're all doing well. And let's just get straight into it. Benjamin Robinson, here we go. Joining me this week on District Divided is a good friend of mine and also the creator of GrindingTheMocks.com, Mr. Benjamin Robinson. Ben, how are you doing this evening?
I'm doing well. I feel like I haven't talked to you in like a few hours.
Yeah, it's been a long few hours too. I'm quite dependent on our conversations during the workday, so it feels very soothing and relaxing to hear that wonderful voice of yours again. Why don't we just get straight into it? Tell us a little bit about what Grinding the Mocks is and sort of just how it came to be.
Yeah, so, we both work in data, and so, I'm always thinking about, as someone who's interested in the world and how we can kind of quantify things and measure things. And I think about that in sports a lot because you know how much we love to talk sports, and that's why, I love District Divided for sure. So I listen to every week. But yeah, so I really love the draft is probably because my hometown team is the Cincinnati Bengals. And when I was growing up in the 1990s, they were one of the worst teams in football. So really, for the most part, the only thing around the Bengals I had to look forward to every year was the draft. And so it's kind of the great equalizer. And in my, fandom growing up, it's kind of ebbed and flowed. Whenever the Bengals have had a high first-round pick, it's given, new hope to people that the Bengals might be good again. The draft has always been something that I've followed pretty closely. And when I was in college, me and a good friend, when I went to college in Pittsburgh, so my best friend from college, or one of my best friends, was a Steelers fan. And so we'd watch the draft every year, and I was sitting on his couch a few years ago. This is the 2018 NFL draft when the Browns selected Baker Mayfield number 1. And we were talking and we were listening to our, the Mike Mayhawks of the world, and they were saying, things along the lines of, that's a reach, or man, I feel like that's a great value. And I said, to my buddy, how do you know that that's real? How do you know that that's actually a value pick? There's probably some conventional wisdom there that's right. I don't deny that these are smart people who know their business, but how do I square about thinking about what a draft reach or a draft value is? And so I came up with this idea for using mock drafts to calculate expected draft position. And so Grinding the Mocks really is a philosophy around, let's think about the draft in a kind of more objective way, in a less subjective way, because the draft is a really objective kind of exercise for the most part in terms of who the public experts are. Let's take their kind of objective data that comes from subjective observation and do more objective things with it. So that's where grinding the mocks comes from. So basically, every year I aggregate, thousands of mock drafts, and I come up with for each player a metric that I call expected draft position, and it gives us a sense of where a player will go in the draft. And when we look at kind of post draft, we look at the actual draft position, and we look at expected draft position. They're actually, it's not surprising that they're pretty correlated, but when you look at the variation in actual draft position, so how much actual draft position goes up and down, how much of it can be explained by what's expected, it turns out that 80% of actual draft position, the variance in that can be explained by expected draft position. So it's actually a very powerful metric, this very basic measure of sort of the average expectation of where we think a player will go in the draft. So it gives us kind of a more evidence-based way of saying, hey, this player, based on all these things about him, where do we think he'll go in the draft? And it gives us a sense of, we know that players can go between picks. There's they can go between the first round and the second round, or the second round and the third round. This gives us a little bit of a more quantitative way of saying what that is. So that's all it is. It's just, let's take the mock drafts, let's do some data stuff with them, and then let's play with the data, because that's what makes it fun.
That's absolutely incredible. And how many mock drafts would you say you've collected this year, for example?
So this year, I think at this point it's about almost 2,500, and so it'll be around that number, I think, by the time we reach Thursday, because this is kind of my the final stretch this week, and so I'll be collecting a lot more mock drafts this week than I have throughout the year, but it'll probably be around 2,500 is how I think it'll end.
Okay, well, if you have any questions about the man's credentials, I think those can all disappear now, because he has taken in over 2,500 mock drafts for grindingthemocks.com, which is a really awesome site. I've definitely played around with the data in there as well. And now you've talked about Joe Burrow as an Ohio kid who's going to be going to Cincinnati, so he's going to be back in state. And Chase Young looks like he's going to be the number 2 pick for the Washington Redskins, him having a homecoming as well. Could you name some other prospects that you've looked at from the DMV area, and what colleges they're at and where they're supposed to go with their expected draft position?
Yeah, definitely. So Chase Young, we'll talk about him later, but he doesn't need to have a lot said about him. He should be a top 5 pick, and that's been kind of the expectation for him the whole year. So that's not surprising, and he's a local guy as well. But some guys that it's really surprising when I looked into some of these guys' backgrounds, how many really high-level prospects are from the DMV. When we normally think of the powerhouse parts of the country that produce really great football players, we think of Florida, we think of Texas, California, the Southeast, like Georgia, Alabama, North Carolina. But DC and Maryland and Virginia have a lot to say. And so I have 4 guys that I think potentially could go pretty high in the first 2 rounds. So number 1 guy kind of after Chase Young is Javon Kinlaw, defensive tackle from South Carolina. And so, when I first looked him up, it said South Carolina. So I thought he must be from South Carolina. But it turns out that he grew up here in DC. And he actually is one of the most inspiring stories of a player in this entire draft. His mom, he lived in Northeast DC, which is kind of where I am. He probably lived a little bit further east than me. But, he was homeless for quite a bit, because at one point his mom moved to PG County for a job, and her situation fell through, and he was homeless. So he's got a very inspirational story. He should be drafted in the middle of the first round. Defensive tackle from South Carolina. Very, very strong draft process this offseason. Very excited for him. Number 2 is a last name that should be something that people who follow DC sports should remember, is Diggs. So the younger brother of Stephon Diggs, Trayvon Diggs, out of the Avalon School in Gaithersburg, and a cornerback from Alabama. So he's like I said, the younger brother of Stephon Diggs, who started at Maryland and played for the Vikings before he was traded for draft picks this offseason to the Buffalo Bills. One of the best wide receivers in the NFL. His younger brother will get drafted higher than him. He should be like a late first round, potentially early second round pick. And then a couple more guys. Yetur Gross-Matos, defensive end from Penn State, from Chancellor High School in Spotsylvania. So kind of on the very edge of the DMV, but I still think it counts, because you can take that metro all the way to Spotsylvania, Fredericksburg. So he should be a late first round pick as well. And then one other guy from the St. John's School here in DC, Alabama outside linebacker Terrell Lewis, who I think will be kind of probably a mid second round pick. So it's like four guys and Chase Young. That's pretty incredible. I think it just speaks to how good the quality of player is here in DC. And there should be quite a few guys from local universities like Maryland and UVA, and well, I guess for fans of folks in the area from Maryland, UVA, and Virginia Tech, they should all have guys that get drafted out of there as well. But those four guys and then Chase Young, a very strong contingent up there with any of the other areas in the country in terms of high level prospects.
Man, that's really cool because, like you said, Florida, Texas, California, we're used to seeing high-level prospects, come from those states and go all over the country. And, you look at the SEC, for example, or even, the Pac-12 at times. And it's cool to see DC or the DMV area as a whole start to represent more, which means if you go to high school games, if you're into that, then you might actually be seeing pro players playing well ahead of their time. So really cool to see. Now let's key in on the team here in the district, which is the Washington Redskins. Now there are three likely scenarios that could occur with that number 2 pick. I'd like you to rank them in order of most likely to least likely for me. So the first possibility is drafting Chase Young. The second possibility is drafting Tua Tagovailoa or another quarterback. And the third possibility is trading down. Can you please rank those three scenarios in order of most likely to happen to least likely to happen?
So I think what's most likely to happen is they're going to draft Chase Young at number 2. It's not what I think is the optimal scenario, but I think that's what's most likely to happen. I don't think there's been any reporting that says that I think they fielded calls. So the number 2 likely thing that they'll do, I think, is trade down. And then number 3 is select Tua. So I think that there's something to be had in Dwayne Haskins. It's not like a Josh Rosen situation from last year where he was demonstrably really awful in his rookie year. And the Cardinals were like, well, Kyler Murray's right there. We're selecting number 1. Let's draft a quarterback because that's the best player that we can get. I don't think that the situation with Dwayne Haskins was that bad last year. Obviously, rookies usually don't do well. And, I can understand why Jay Gruden was kind of upset because he got fired very early on into the season trying to keep his job. But yeah, so I think it's going to go Chase Young because I don't think I've heard as much in the media about Washington being involved with trade down or even with Tua. I think that'd be a bigger surprise. Trading down would be really interesting, and that's what I think is the best move, just because they're so bad on offense and they're so bad on defense, and they also just need picks. They traded away their second-round pick last year to trade back into the first round with the Indianapolis Colts to select defensive end Montez Sweat from Mississippi State, and that second-round pick is pick 34, which is basically a first-round pick. So it's a very shrewd move by the Colts, and so when you have as many problem areas on offense and defense as Washington does, I think it would behoove them to trade down to get more picks, especially in the second and third rounds. And so the number 2 pick is a very valuable pick, and I'm sure we're gonna talk about if they were going to trade down, what they would get. But I think that there's a lot of situations where if you're going to keep Dwayne Haskins, let's try to help him out. Let's get him some protection in the offensive line. Trent Williams, there's a huge issue there where he's a very, very capable player, but he doesn't want to play for your team. So what are you going to do about that? You need to protect him. And then also, there's an issue with the receiving core. Terry McLaurin was a pleasant surprise. I don't think you can expect to get, at his selection where he was last year. I would love to have another wide receiver on this team to really open up the offense and give Dwayne Haskins the support he needs to succeed, and then sneakily build up the defense, which I think, if you add Chase Young, it's going to make a strength even stronger. But at some point, I think they need to stop drafting defensive linemen and start drafting cornerbacks because it's a passing league now. And so you need to protect the passer and then defend the pass. And so to me, trading down would be really optimal for them, but I don't think they're going to do it. I think they're going to stay put and take Chase Young.
Okay, and so, I think you're pretty aware that I've been championing, drafting Tua, for example, because while I do think Dwayne is good and can be special, I think the likelihood that Tua can be is, through the roof. But so again, in terms of what you think they should do, it sounds like you're saying trade down is your number one option. And then what would you rank 2 versus 3? Would you say drafting Tua second, or would you say drafting Chase Young second?
I would draft Tua second. So to me, it's like the whole thing about Tua, and I think we've spoken about this. So I view Tua Tagovailoa like the Joel Embiid of this draft. I don't know who the Andrew Wiggins of this draft is. I don't think that's Joe Burrow, but I view him as a Joel Embiid type player, and I'll say it like this. So he is a high variance play. So that means that I think he'll either be really good or he'll be hurt, and that'll be a huge issue. But you still have Dwayne Haskins, so you don't know exactly what you have at quarterback. I agree that you should still try to build around him, like I've mentioned before, and that's why the number one option for me is to get more picks so I can pick more impact players to help protect him and give him more weapons on offense. But the upside for Tua, if he does pan out, is really strong. And if Dwayne Haskins is still a decent prospect, you can still trade him at some point. But the mantra that I like to believe in is if you don't know if you have a quarterback, you don't have a quarterback. And it's the most important position on the field. So to me, Tua is a really high variance pick, and so the third quarterback in the draft in terms of expected draft position is Justin Herbert from Oregon. And so to me, the difference between Tua and Justin Herbert is that Justin Herbert, I think you understand what he can do. His range of expected outcomes in terms of performance in the league, I think is a little bit narrower. It's probably above average. He'll probably be an above average quarterback. I think he compares to like Mitch Trubisky, who's an above average quarterback, and Jared Goff, potentially, who's an above average quarterback. But yeah, I don't think that's going to happen. But then Tua, potentially, the range of possibility could be, he gets hurt and he doesn't play a lot, to, he could be like potentially, I don't want to say Drew Brees or Russell Wilson because that's really high, but he has the possibility to be in like a range of quarterback that's much better than Justin Herbert. So I think he gets the Brees and Wilson comparisons because he's relatively short. Um, but yeah, so to me, if you think Dwayne Haskins is the guy, then I think you really just need to draft players around him. Receiver class is really, really deep. And so there's a lot of guys I think that could be had that are helpful. And then, maybe you trade Trent Williams. Maybe that's something they do in this draft. Trading players in the draft is kind of hard, I've learned, because if there's a problem medically speaking, then you have to figure out a way to get compensated if the medical check fails. So that's why you don't often see players get traded during the draft. They get traded before the draft. And so we're kind of getting really close. So if anything, I think Trent Williams gets traded or released at some point. But ideally, you trade him maybe for 2021 draft picks instead of 2020 draft picks, which would be a shame, but it is what it is.
Fair enough. So let's hone in on what you would do, which is trade that pick. Who is most likely to trade with the Redskins for that number 2 pick? Now, we've heard about the Dolphins. We've heard about the Chargers. I don't know about any other dark horse team as of right now. But of those 2 teams or that dark horse, like, who do you think the Redskins could trade that pick to? And what do you think they could actually just get in return for it?
So yeah, in addition to the Dolphins and the Chargers, I think the Jaguars have something to say. So they also have a decent amount of draft picks, and they say that they like Gardner Minshew, but I think I like Dwayne Haskins better than Gardner Minshew, without question. The pedigree is just so much better, and the potential for high-level play is a lot better. So I think the Jaguars could be in there, that they've said like what they've said, but for the most part, you shouldn't believe what people say. They'll just say things just to put out in the world, and then play hard to get, and then when they want to make a trade, they can do it. So the issue is it's harder to trade up from where the Jaguars are to where Washington is, and I'll tell you why. So there's basically 2 philosophies in trading, and so it starts with what you'll hear is the draft trade value chart, and it was created by Jimmy Johnson, who just got inducted to the Pro Football Hall of Fame, I believe, and he's was the coach for the Cowboys, and the Cowboys during his time as head coach were very cavalier in trading in the draft. And Jerry Jones has a background, believe it or not, in oil drilling in the South, right? And so he made his money by basically having a kind of market advantage in terms of he would go after oil wells that people thought were less likely to have oil in them, so they were cheaper, and then he'd hit it rich. So, Jerry Jones has this oil money, and the same guy who helped him find these oil wells was the guy who came up with this draft chart. It's called the Jimmy Johnson chart because Jimmy Johnson was the main user. He was kind of along with Jerry Jones, they made all the selections. And so what they did was they took every draft pick and they gave it a value. And so every draft pick has a value. So for example, in the Jimmy Johnson chart, the number 2 pick has a value of 2,600 points. So in order to trade, and so they originally were the only people who had this chart. So they made tons of trades, very, very lucrative trades. And so in some ways, this chart is a little outdated, but it's still being used around the league. So 2,600 points for the number 2 pick. In the traditional Jimmy Johnson chart, if the Dolphins, who have 3 first-round picks, wanted to trade up to the number 2 pick in the Jimmy Johnson chart system, they would need to trade pick 5, which is worth 1,700 points. They need to trade pick 18, which is worth 900 points. So it's honestly, I think that's a bit outdated. I think that if the Redskins were going to make a trade for that selection, I think people would be disappointed. I think that, also, honestly, I think they want more picks, and maybe they would add in some second round picks. So there are other ways of thinking about draft trade value charts. So there's a guy named Chase Stewart who created his own system based on kind of more recent trade data and the value of picks. And so he values the number 2 pick at 30.2 points on his scale. And so if we were to make the trade for this 5 and 18 pick that the Dolphins have, they also have pick 26, then that would equal, I'm doing like really quick math here, it would be equal 30.5 points. So it's still, that's the kind of haul you would have to expect from the Dolphins, 5 and 18. So if you're comfortable with getting 5 and 18, which I think is actually, it's not bad. But to me, I'd want some more second round picks. So the Chargers, for example, to make that kind of move, it would be pick 6 and pick 37. And so that would equal around like 32 points, just because of the way that the math works. So, either way, getting 5 and 18 for number 2 is actually a really good value. But yeah, so the draft trade chart, those are the things that teams use. And so the Jimmy Johnson chart is the most classic one. And so 5 plus 18 equals 2. And that might seem a little antithetical to people, but that's what the research does. And that's what it says. And that's what a lot of teams use. They use that chart.
Cool. And so let's say the Redskins did trade down. You've mentioned, okay, so if it's with the Dolphins, I assume that they would probably take Jeff Okudah, because then I would assume the Lions would take Chase Young, and it sounds like the Giants are leaning Isaiah Simmons right now. Now, if they traded to the Chargers, for example, that's pick 6. Let's say Okudah goes 5. Or, I'm sorry, in that case, I guess somebody else would go 5. But then would you go like Jerry Jeudy? You're talking about putting explosive wide receivers around for Dwayne Haskins. Would you do that? Or it is a deep wide receiver class, we've heard. So like someone like KJ Hill or KJ Hamler goes down the line. What would you do around pick 6 if you had traded with the Chargers, for example?
So to me, if you're trading to 6, I think there's a decent chance that Isaiah Simmons is there.
Oh, okay.
So I think he's really great. Yeah, his expected draft position is around 6. So he's kind of a really new kind of player in this league where, at Clemson, they had him playing at a bunch of different positions. So he played at safety. He played linebacker. He actually played slot cornerback. He occasionally even rushed the passer and did all those things. He actually did very well in coverage. So Simmons is a really great player. I think that he would be a great addition to the team if you're on defense. At that point in the draft, at 6, you should also be able to get any of the offensive tackles you want. So to me, at pick 6, you could get Tristan Wirfs from Iowa, who, I think he's a better prospect than Brandon Sheriff. He projects to be kind of a potential bookend left tackle on the team, which would be huge. And then, with the Chargers, you'd probably have to get a second round pick, and you could pick Brandon Ayuk from Arizona State, who, I think could be in the first round, but could also be in the early second round, or Jalen Reagor. You can get a really nice wide receiver at pick 38 or 37, whichever pick that the Chargers have in the second round. So to me, I'd rather have Simmons and a wide receiver or Tristan Wirfs and a wide receiver than just Chase Young, where I have positions that's pretty got a lot of depth there, and so you're making a strength even stronger. But at what point do you stop drafting first round defensive linemen when you have Deron Payne, you have Jonathan Allen on the final year of a deal, you have Ryan Kerrigan, you have Matt Ioannidis, like you have guys.
And Montez Sweat can also rush, and he actually had a pretty good
Montez Sweat,
year. Yeah. And that's a good point. Like, when do you stop? So it is a very tricky question. I think Chase Young, being from the area, has a certain pull to it as well. Being teammates with Dwayne Haskins also has a certain pull to it. So it's a very interesting and sort of unique situation that the Redskins are in. I can understand. And I understand where you're coming from with the trade down idea. Out of curiosity, you said Isaiah Simmons at 6. In that scenario, who would the Giants be taking it for?
I think it's one of the offensive tackles. So David Gettleman, the general manager of the New York Giants, has never traded down in a draft, like at any point ever that he's done, whether it was when it was with the Panthers or with the Giants. He's traded up, but he's never traded down. So if he traded down, it would kind of be a departure from the norm for him. So, any of the offensive tackles, or Isaiah Simmons could be the pick there as well.
Right.
But in this situation, if I think he isn't, then, Tristan Wirfs, Jedrick Wills, Mekhi Becton, and Andrew Thomas. So Jedrick Wills from Alabama, Tristan Wirfs, who I said before, from Iowa, Mekhi Becton from Louisville, and Andrew Thomas from Georgia. Those are the top 4 offensive tackles, and I project them to be, top 15 picks in this draft. The offensive tackle position and the wide receiver position, that could make up like half the first round potentially.
Wow.
Of players. It probably won't be that much, but it could be, I think it could be like 13 offensive tackles and wide receivers taken in the first round, and I wouldn't be surprised. So it would be quite a scene, but that's where the strength in this draft class is, offensive tackle and wide receiver.
Fair enough. Well, yeah, I mean, then in that case, it would make a lot of sense to trade down. I guess I'm sort of the belief that when you can get a surefire talent, I think it's very hard to find what we'll call maybe presidential talents instead of generational. I think that's an overused term. Presidential being like once every 4 years or so. We had Myles Garrett a little while back. Now we have Chase Young. When you can get a guy like that seems very surefire, that seems like he could be a perennial Pro Bowler, you do that because the rest of it seems to be a little bit more of a crapshoot. Or if you can get that superstar potential quarterback, you roll the dice in Tua. But I understand what you're saying with the trade down. Now, last week, we had a guest, Kadeen Wiggins, who, diehard Skins fan, knows his stuff. He highlighted 5 different players. Now, there is Tyler Biadasz, and this is for the later rounds, might I add, for the Redskins. Tyler Biadasz, who's a center from Wisconsin. Ben Barch, guard from St. John's in Minnesota. Davion Taylor, linebacker. Ashton Davis, safety, Cal. And Van Jefferson, wide receiver. Where in your data are those 5 players going, if you know?
So I don't say that I know, but because the whole thing with the mock drafts is that it's all based on public information. So there's a lot of information that we're not privy to around medicals, around character stuff. Some of that stuff comes out, some of it doesn't. And also it could be that teams or the mock drafts have a very different idea of player evaluation than teams do. So let's do a quick rundown of the Redskins picks. So they have pick number 2 in the first round. They have pick 66, which is in the third round. They lost that second round pick in the trade last year. They have 2 picks in the fourth round, 108 and 142. They have a pick in the 5th round and then 2 7th-round picks. So when I say that they don't have a lot of picks in this draft in the upper range, it's just really true. You really don't hit on players in the 4th round and after that much. So that's a big issue. So in terms of the guys that that Kadeem brought up, the first one was Tyler Biadasz. So Tyler Biadasz, it's a real interesting story because at the beginning of the season, I think he was thought of as a first-round pick. And I think he might have been hurt this year, and then also his play kind of wasn't as strong. I kind of thought he would have come out last year, and he might have been the first offensive lineman taken. So it's sort of a situation where he probably should have gone last year, because right now I have his expected draft position kind of in the 3rd round, anywhere between, around 75. So that's kind of like so to be honest, he should be available at the Redskins' 3rd round pick because, they have that. They don't have that 2nd round pick. So he's available. I think it'd be at the kind of top of his range, but he'll be there. In terms of Ben Barch from St. John's, so we didn't know anything about him, and then he showed up at the Senior Bowl and he did really well. So normally you would expect this guy to be like more undrafted or very, very late rounds, but I also have him somewhere in the third round. So the problem is because Washington has, those picks at 104 and 142, I don't think that Ben Barch will be there. I think that it'll be in the third round. And so 106 is the last pick in the third round. And so if they were to draft Ben Barch, if they wanted him that badly, they'd have to draft him at 66, which I think is a little bit of a reach in terms of his talent, which is why you want to get more picks. So if you had more picks, I would say, hey, like, let's throw a dart at a guy. He's a good player. He has some opportunities to. We'll see how he plays with pros, but he played really well at the Senior Bowl. So then you mentioned Davion Taylor, linebacker from Colorado. He's a guy who I think will be available in the fifth round. I have his expected draft position at 174. He's a really interesting story as well. His parents are Seventh-day Adventists, and so he actually didn't play high school football at all. He played on a team, but he never played in a game. And so when he became 18, they told him he could make his own decisions. And this is like another really interesting story, but he went to a junior college and then ended up at Colorado, and so he really hasn't played a lot of football. He played at the Senior Bowl as well and caught some people's eyes, but the main thing about him was he ran really well at the combine. And so that helps because the NFL values speed and athleticism at linebacker quite a bit more than you're running downhill, stopping the run type of linebacker. So he'd probably be available at their fifth round pick, which is 148. Then you mentioned Ashton Davis from Cal, and so he's another guy. So those are, I think all these guys actually played at the Senior Bowl, to be totally honest. Now that I think about it, so Ashton Davis, safety from Cal. I think that he was thought of as a second round pick, but now he's more of a third round pick. I think there's some other safeties who also played at the Senior Bowl who kind of overshadowed him. So I have his expected draft position as 68. So that is a third round. So once again, those are three guys who I think if you wanted to take them, you'd have to take them at 66. And this is the problem where when you have so few draft picks, if you like a guy, there's such a huge weight between when you pick at 66 and then when you pick at 104 that if there's a guy you really want, you might have to trade up and sacrifice future draft capital, but you don't want to do that. So to me, that's why trading down is so helpful. If you can accrue picks in the second round, you can fill some of these spots on your team. And that's the thing about Chase Young. We know he's going to be good. He's also at a less valuable, like, premier position. So people think of defensive end as a very premier position, but that's just because they watch football on television and it's all you can see. It turns out that cornerback is actually a really valuable position as well. And so Washington has problems at cornerback. So, but Ashton Davis is thought of as a very good safety. He can cover fairly well. I think he's more known as a run player, but he's very athletic. And then the last guy is Van Jefferson, a wide receiver from Florida. So he had a great Senior Bowl as well. He's thought of as kind of a very kind of mature player in terms of his game. But the problem is at the combine, they found a medical issue, and so that's an issue for him. And so his expected draft position is 114. So I think that he could be available with one of the fourth round picks. So I think it'll probably be the earlier fourth round pick if you want to have him, but he's available to them in their fourth round range. So, we had Biadasz in the third round, Barch in the third round, Taylor in the fifth round, Davis in the third round, and Jefferson in the fourth round. So those are the guys that that Kadeem mentioned, and I think that the problem is they just don't have enough picks. You can't take all of these guys. You only have 3 picks after the first round: 66, 104, 142 in the third and the fourth round, and those are some late picks. And it's just rough when you see this team that needs to get better at a lot of places, how they can do that with the kind of draft picks that they have, and that's why trading, I think, would be a positive development for them. And I think it could help out Dwayne Haskins a lot because we need to protect him and give him offensive weapons so that we can see how good he really is, so that we know what kind of quarterback we have. And so if we don't know what type of quarterback we have, we can continue to kind of go down the road of mediocrity or even below average play. And then we're nowhere better than we are today. And then if you have Chase Young, you have a good player, but there are plenty of great pass rushers who played on bad teams. I mean, just look at J.J. Watt. imagine how good the Texans could have been if they had drafted a quarterback earlier. They've only recently gotten better with the addition of Deshaun Watson. J.J. Watt's played at a high level, one of the best players in the league for years, but they never were that good. Good as good as they are now, really. The potential they have with Watson is sky high. And maybe Haskins will turn into that kind of player, but we just don't know yet. But we need to figure it out. We need to figure it out fast.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I wonder if the Redskins, knowing that, might make some moves to get more picks in those later rounds, as you said. So who knows? Maybe that trade down from 2 is with the team, and you do end up acquiring more mid-round picks there to be able to get guys, like you said, like Tyler Biadasz, Ben Barch, Davion Taylor, Ashton Davis, Van Jefferson, that Kadeen had pointed out. Just, before we wrap up, any other players you could see the Redskins taking besides those guys that Kadeen mentioned?
Not off the top of my head. I'm not really as strong about saying this player fits what a certain team does, but I'll tell you what we know about the Redskins from last season. So there's a metric called Pythagorean wins, and it just looks at kind of the high-level statistics, and it says how many wins based off of teams that have had this type of statistical profile, how many wins should they have? And the Redskins' actual win total versus their Pythagorean win total were pretty much the same, around 3 games. So they are what we thought they were. They're bad in a lot of areas. So, to me, Dwayne Haskins represents the future of the team. And so, like I said, to me, the more players that you can build around him, the better. And that's why I'm an advocate of trading down as much as they can here, because there's a new regime in town. It's sort of the same regime, right? Because Dan Snyder is still there, but you need to do more to help Dwayne Haskins. So there's some offensive tackles, I think that are decent projects that could be available at that point in the draft. I think, like you said, Ben Barch, he's more of a guard. Let's get a tackle. Let's take a shot at some tackles. I said wide receiver is really high. I think that there could be an impact wide receiver available in the 3rd round, like Chase, not a Chase Claypool, but Gabriel Davis I really like from Central Florida. I think he could be really good. And to me, like 3rd round wide receiver, that's kind of the end of where you can get really good wide receivers, I think, or at least guys that could be good because of how good this wide receiver class is. So I say, check out Gabriel Davis. I like him quite a bit. In terms of offensive tackle, at that spot as well, Lucas Niang from Texas Christian could be a guy that's available in the 3rd round. I think that he has a shot on being pretty good. Prince Tega Winogo, I think he could go in the top 100 as well from Auburn. So, I said Gabriel Davis, I said Prince Tega Winogo and Lucas Niang if you're looking for offensive tackles. And if I think of another wide receiver, let me look at my data real quick for the 3rd round for wide receiver. Donovan Peoples-Jones is in there. Chase Claypool from Notre Dame. Chase Claypool from Notre Dame I think would be great for the Redskins, actually. He's a really big wide receiver. Some people think of him as a tight end, but then when he ran at the combine, it was pretty electric. Chase Claypool, Gabriel Davis, I'm a big fan of both of them. And then, like I said, Lucas Niang, Prince Tega Winogo, respectively. I think those guys could all be really good 3rd round selections to add more to help Dwayne Haskins in any number of ways.
Well, you talk about 3rd round wide receivers helping out Dwayne Haskins, and Skins fans need to look no further than last year when they drafted scary Terry McLaurin in the 3rd round. So I think they know all about value in the 3rd round at the wide receiver position. Ben Robinson, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for your time. The floor is yours. How can we find you? Where can we interact with you?
So I definitely recommend checking out grindingthemocks.com. So that's where you can see a lot of this information. And if you're really interested in what I have to say about the draft, you can find me on Twitter at BENJ_Robinson.
Beautiful. And I can also attest to this. Ben is very active on social media. If you have a question and reach out to him, he's going to get back to you, and he's happy to engage in any sort of conversation of that matter. So Ben Robinson, thanks again so much, and enjoy the rest of your evening.